And what I'd like to tell you about today is a couple of examples in which refugees were refused entry into countries and, as a result, suffered tragic fates. Firstly, I'd like to tell you the story of the St Louis, which, in fact, quite a few of my Jewish friends don't know. So it's a really interesting story. What it's about, the St Louis, in fact, was a German ocean liner, and it was notable for a voyage in 1939 in which its captain, Gustav Schroeder, tried to find homes for 937 German Jewish refugees who were seeking asylum from Nazi persecution. It's important to tell you this, that the German Captain Schroeder was not, in fact, Jewish. He was a non-Jewish German who wished to save lives. He went to great lengths to ensure dignified treatment for all his passengers on the St Louis. The St Louis set sail from Hamburg to Cuba on the 30th of May 1939. The ship anchored at Havana Harbour on the 27th of May 1939, but it was denied entry to the usual docking areas. 6 days later, the Cuban government refused to accept the passengers. They had already purchased legal visas, but they could enter, and they could not enter either as tourists or refugees. None of the passengers were aware of this fact, but what the Cuban government had done, they had retroactively invalidated their landing permits. So they were prohibited from landing in Cuba. Therefore, the captain, he was still adamant he wanted to save lives. So he circled Florida, hoping for permission to enter the United States, but all to no avail. A group of clergy and academics in Canada then said that they would like the ship to try and enter Canada with all the refugees. But what happened, there was a very anti-Semitic immigration officer, and he persuaded the Prime Minister not to accept the passengers. So to conclude, despite being refused entry to Cuba, the US and Canada, Captain Schroeder refused to take the ship back to Germany until all the passengers had been given entry to other countries in Europe. The UK agreed to accept 288 refugees. 224 were accepted by France, 214 by Belgium, and 181 were accepted by the Netherlands. Thankfully, all the refugees who were from the St Louis ship who settled in the UK survived the war, but those accepted by France, Belgium and the Netherlands were not so lucky. It's been estimated that 250 of the passengers from the St Louis who were accepted by countries other than the UK perished in concentration camps. All the refugees would have survived if either Cuba, the US and Canada had accepted these desperate refugees. Secondly, just a very quick mention that there is evidence that the famous Jewish schoolgirl diarist, you may have heard of, I'm sure you've all heard of her actually, Anne Frank. In 2007, it was discovered that Anne Frank and her family were denied entry to the US. The article in the New York Times reported that documents were discovered which the Frank family had attempted at entry to the US. These documents showed that European Jews could not overcome the State Department's restrictions against the refugees. By 1941, no one with close relatives still in Germany was allowed into the US because of suspicions that the Nazis could use them to blackmail refugees into clandestine operations. This development ended the possibility of getting the Frank girls out through a children's rescue agency. Anne's father, Otto, in fact, was granted a visa from Cuba, but it was cancelled just 10 days later when Germany declared war on the US. The Frank family, having been refused entry to the US, you probably all know, went into hiding in Amsterdam. Mrs. Frank and her two daughters, Margot and Anne, died in Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Otto Frank survived and married a lady called Mrs. Schloss. After the war, Eva Schloss became Anne Frank's stepsister. I will conclude with the words of Eva Schloss, who recently drew parallels between the Syrian refugee crisis and the Jewish refugee crisis of World War II. Anne Frank's stepsister said as follows: "You must not be selfish. You must share whatever you have and help in a desperate situation. The refugees need help from you." And just on a final note, if Anne Frank hadn't have been refused the visa to the US, she'd be alive today. She'd be about 85, living in Boston, and she'd probably have been the President of the United States.